you have a population of people from Africa, from different nations, who are de-ethnicized. Their language is taken away. Their culture is taken away. Their spirituality is decimated. Their names are taken away. Families are destroyed. They become breeders of even more labor. You have children, and then those children are torn away from you, and you never know where they go, and they become labor in some part of the world. I mean, there is, if you talk about man's inhumanity to man, you see the way we breed chicken now, the way we breed cows now, the way we breed horses now, that is the way Africans were dealt with by the enslavers in the United States and in Europe and in the Caribbean.
This is the journey to one Africa.
The impact of slavery is something that must be seen from two different fronts. From the perspective of the enslaver, it was one of the most lucrative industries, if you may, that they ever undertook. If you look at the history of Europe, the history of America, to mean the United States of America, to mean Latin America or South America, you will discover that those civilizations were built on the back of slaves. But to the slave, it was debilitating and humiliating, and the impact is alive today. And the impact, it is not only economic, it is spiritual, it is cultural, it is political, it is total. And one need only see what happened to the slaves who were taken to the United States of America. First of all, you lost your language. And I think Alex Haley has done a very good job in dramatizing it through his movie Roots. They took away your name. They took away your God. They took away your language. They took away all the things that you valued. And if you go to Latin America, you also discover, you go to Colombia, you go to Brazil, you see how devastating it was. You go to the Caribbean, whether it's St. Kitts and Nevis, or whether Trinidad and Tobago, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and Grenadines, you see the impact of slavery. And not only that, if you move out of the slavery that we call the Transatlantic Triangle, and you go into the Arab world, where we now know that over 18 million people were transported, and we now know that men were castrated, you can see how they have completely been Arabized, so that they do not even think of their African roots. That is how devastating slavery was. And the impact continues, because once you have lost your all, you've lost your humanity. To claim it back, it is an intergenerational thing. We now know quite a number of people who suffered in the manner that they did and continue to suffer, trying to reconnect with their root. The DNA tracing is in itself a quest for people to find themselves so that they can be who they were and so that they can pay homage to their ancestors. The continent remains the richest continent on earth in terms of many things. And whenever people talk about riches, we are quick to talk about natural resources. But to me, the most important of the resources is the human resource. Africa was invaded and people were enslaved because of the human resource. In fact, I know of a story about slavery in Costa Rica, where the Spaniards were trying to build a railway from Port Limon to San Jose in Costa Rica. And they tried the Chinese, they died of malaria. They tried everybody until they went to Jamaica and picked the slaves who had been there, and they are the ones who came and built the railway to Port Limon. because of human resource before industrialization. If you look at every other sector, look at the sugar plantations of Sao Tome, off the coast of Angola and the Democratic Republic of Congo. They took people from the Congo Kingdom and took them to Sao Tome. The rubber plantations, human resource. Africa was rich and still remains rich. But what Africa is famed for is her natural resources. Talk of gold, talk of iron ore, talk of cobalt, talk of uranium, talk of rare earth, talk of copper, talk of all these things, talk of timber, even in terms of looking at our flora and fauna, and you look at what we have in terms of what gives the world the pharmaceutical products. It was true then, it is true now. And that is why when the European powers came to the continent of Africa and they were fighting each other, remember they were fighting each other in different corners of Africa. In Angola, the Dutch were fighting the Portuguese. In the other part, the Germans were fighting, the French were fighting, the colonialists were fighting. And then they said, why are we fighting? This hunting ground is so rich that we had just better divide it into spheres of influence. That is the context in which the conference in Berlin that was put together by Otto von Bismarck must be understood. So they divided into spheres of influence because of the riches. Even the decolonization process the colonization process before decolonization was based on the better management of the resources, so that the human resource continue to be a resource, but you're also using the natural resources to industrialize Europe. The Europe that we now see industrialized did so on the back of African resources. The America that we now see industrialized did so on the back of African resources. The Latin America. So Africa has been the place where you get resources and take it to other parts of the world, particularly Europe and America, and use it for purposes of the benefit. And to that extent, Africa has been impoverished. So that Africa is the least industrialized of all the continents, because at critical moments, both her people and her resources have been taken away, and all her attempts at industrialization have been frustrated to the extent that they have not realized their potential. So the impact is huge, but that does not mean that Africa is poor. Africa, with a population of 1.4 billion and increasing, the youngest population in the world, with most of the resources already still resident in the continent of Africa, we only have to change our mind and stop exporting raw products or primary products and begin to have them made here, value addition. Then sooner rather than later, we will be flying on a different plane in terms of converting our resources into things that will improve the quality of our lives. The paradox of Africa is so rich, yet so poor, a paradox. It used to be said, and it was right, that the flag followed the cross, that is as regards Christianity. And as Europe and America were subdividing Africa for economic reasons, they were also subdividing Africa from a religious perspective. So that when you look at Africa, you see the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church to be specific, is one of the largest landowners across the continent of Africa. In every African country, the Roman Catholic Church has large tracts of land. They are a sphere of influence, whether you are talking about their presence in Uganda or in Kenya or in Angola or in all those other countries. Remember, the Roman Pope was a politician. And in the 15th and 16th century, when the oceans were being subdivided for exploration, it is the Roman Catholic Pope who divided the oceans between Spain and Portugal at that time. That is the Roman Catholic Church. The Anglican Church, whenever you saw the British they also came with the Anglican Church. And remember, I keep on reminding those who are in the Anglican tradition that the Anglican Church was created through a rebellion in 1534 when King Henry VIII was denied the right to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. And he became the head of the Roman Catholic Church. The British monarch is the head of the Roman Catholic Church. So this is an established church. Wherever they went, you see the governor's house, and next to the governor's house is the archbishop's house. Either it's in Kenya, or in Uganda, or in Tanzania, or in Ghana, or in Nigeria, or in Zimbabwe, spheres of influence. And where the Germans were dominant, you see the Lutheran Church. And where the Scots had a presence, you see the Presbyterian Church. So it is true that religion was used. And the Bible has been used in very negative ways. The Dutch Reformed Church, which gave the religious legitimacy to the apartheid regime in South Africa, proceeded on the premise that the races were unequal. So religion was used to dehumanize the black South Africans by the Dutch Reformed Church, which founded and formed the so-called spiritual basis for the apartheid regime. The churches were there when people were being colonized. They were there when people were being discriminated against, while the same Bible that they read said that there is no Jew, no Gentile, no man, no woman. Yet they allowed it to happen. The religion was used to pacify, and the culture and the whole idea of turn the other cheek. Religion did not preach being a keeper of one's brother or sister. Religion did not assert that we should be good Samaritans. The people in religion became bad Samaritans. And it is instructive that in the recent past, the Roman Catholic Church has apologized. The Anglican Church has apologized because they know that they were complicit both in slavery and in colonization, and that they continue to do harm in the name of religion. Islam is not innocent. Islam, which is articulated in the Quran, is quite clear about the things and how you should deal with people. But Islam also became an instrument of Arabization, which was not what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, prescribed. But those who are bringing Islam to the coastal part of Africa also used it to Arabize the population. The net effect, therefore, when you talk about the impact and the influence of religion in the continent of Africa, is that it's part of the problem rather than part of the solution. That does not take away the fact that there are certain good things that these religious organizations also did. We must not be all negative. It's true that in a number of areas they improved education, therefore eliminated illiteracy. It is true that they built hospitals and therefore helped in the reduction and elimination of diseases. But when you put it on the weighing scale, the impact, the negative impact of religion psychologically and otherwise continues to be an albatross that hangs on the neck of the people of color in Africa. And something must be done to decolonize religion in order that we may indeed enjoy the dividends of a relationship with God. And if you look at the history of Africa, there have been attempts at fighting that. In the 16th century, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, what we call it now, in the Congo Kingdom, there was a lady called Kimpavita or Donna Beatrice, who told his people that indeed, of course, debatable, Jesus was black and was a Congolese. But I can understand where Kimpavita or Donna Beatrice was coming from. She was trying to tell the people that we should not simply accept the version of Jesus that has been brought to us from Europe and America. And when Donna Beatrice left, in the same Congo, there was Simon Kimbangu, who also came and made certain contribution. In fact, when Kimbangu died in 1951, he had already predicted that Congo would be free. He had already predicted that there would be economic recovery. So there have always been Africans who have tried to appropriate the good aspects of religion, whether it is Islam or it is Christianity. In the Islamic tradition, we remember the activities of Uthman Dan Fodio or Uthman Dan Fodio in the northern part of what is now Nigeria, and his version of Islam, trying to give it an African flavor so that it's something that is positive to the people. So whenever we talk about religion, we must understand that it had and continues to have a very negative impact on African peoples, preaching a gospel where we think that prayer without work will be the mother of all the things we have ever wished for. Yet we know that the divine instruction was that you shall eat by the sweat of thy brow. You know, religion is man-made. And anything that is touched by man and made by man, particularly many of these organizations, including religion, they have an agenda, hidden or otherwise. So the more religious you are, sometimes the less spiritual you are. Because religion creates hierarchy. You have the archbishop, you have the Pope in the Roman Catholic, you have the cardinals, you have the archbishops, you have the bishops, you have the priests. And all of them enjoy Pharisaic life. They love life. And we have history of popes who engaged in all manner of criminal activities. And they wanted to be worshipped. In fact, when I look at the history of the Roman Catholic Church, and I look at how Martin Luther came out with his 95 theses at the church in Wittenberg, when he's saying that the popes must stop using the church for evil purposes. It was a rebellion against religion. When you look at the Anglican Church, you can see how religion was used to deify man. When you look at Islam, we have had versions of Islam where people preach everything that is contrary to the instructions of Allah and the Prophet of God, Muhammad, peace be upon him. And all these tell you that we lost our spirituality. And one of the things that Western religion did was to attack African spirituality, so that you lost your connection to God. Because in many African communities, the connection between man and God was a direct thing. And you had your ancestors interceding for you, which they said was unchristian, but yet when you are Christian, you pray to the God of Abraham, Moses, and Joseph, who are their ancestors, and they tell us we must not mention our ancestors when we are praying. So it is true that one of the things that attacks spirituality and creates a distance between us and God is organized religion, which we now know by dint of history, and even as we observe today, has some of the most corrupt practices, some of the most pernicious practices against men. We have seen cultic religions which have come where individuals become rich at the expense of their congregants. Religion is the thief of spirituality. You know, when you look at religion, specifically spirituality rather than religion, God, in his own divine way, having created man, ensured that man's environment, wherever he or she was, whether he's in Europe or America or in the Middle East, there is a sense in which your connection with him, to mean God, was mediated through many ways, including nature. And you look at every tradition, even if you choose to look at the books which are written, many African spirituality is not rendered in written books which were destroyed. But look at the Christian Bible and the Old Testament, which is fundamentally the Jewish Torah, you can see how they were praying to their God, how they went to the mountains, how they had prophets such as Elijah saying that it will not rain, and then it did not. What is the difference between Elijah and some of our seers amongst the Agikuyu of Kenya, or amongst the Zulu of South Africa, or amongst the Luo then of Sudan, or amongst the Yoruba, or amongst the Igbo, or amongst the Nama in what is present-day Namibia, or amongst the Temne, or amongst the Wolof, or amongst the Dogon in Mali? There is no difference. And those who want to destroy and confuse you, when they come and attack you, the first thing they do is to attack your God, attack your spirituality, because once there is a spiritual disconnect between you and your God, then you can be dominated, and then you lose everything. Look at in the area of pharmaceuticals. We had healers in African land. We now know that brain surgery was undertaken in the continent of Africa. We now know that there were cesarean births in the continent of Africa. But when we were disrupted, we lost all that, and we now think that in order to be a doctor, you must be trained in the tradition of the Western world. But if you look at other civilizations which have borrowed and which have survived and which retained their mode of doing things, they continued with their way of doing. Go to China. You still talk about Chinese medicine because they did not lose. And that has not prevented them from embracing what is good from other civilizations. Go to India, Ayurveda, and you find that the Indians have continued with that particular tradition. But when you come to Africa, when we have our herbalists, because we are mentally confused, courtesy of miseducation and spiritual dominance, when we have people who are healers in our society, we condemn them as witch doctors. So it is the battle against the impact of slavery and colonization combined is a battle of unlearning many negative things which were pumped into our minds so that we could become robots. And robots we have become in many ways because we do things simply because certain information was pumped in our heads. We have been taught consistently to hate ourselves and to love the things that belong to others. So when we have conversations about religion and about the impact of slavery, it is a conversation which is reminding us that we should go back to ourselves. There is a beautiful saying in the Kiswahili in the Kiswahili language called mwachamila ni mtumwa. If you abandon your culture and tradition, you become a slave. And that is exactly what happened to us. We abandoned our culture and tradition and way of doing things, and even when we deny it, we are still slaves, mentally. When you look at African traditional religion, and we use the word religion because I'm speaking in English. If I was talking in some of the African languages, perhaps I would not use the word religion, but spirituality. One of them, as we know, is Simon Kimbangu, who was himself a Baptist, started as a Baptist preacher, and then moved on to form his own church, if you may, or his own religious movement. And Kimbanguism is an example of one of African religions which has survived today. In fact, in the year 2011, during the presidency of Joseph Kabila, they held a conference to discuss the life of Simon Kimbangu. And there are many Kimbanguis. In fact, it is estimated that there are 6 million people in the Democratic Republic of Congo who follow the diktats of Simon Kimbangu. And Kimbangu is not the only African who has been in that space. In Kenya, for example, we have had several African religious movements which were called African tradition religions. Akorino is such a religion in Kenya. Nomia is such a religion in Kenya. Legio Maria is such a religion. And if you go to West Africa, you'll find similar activities, and even in Southern Africa. And what has happened is that these African religions have much more spiritual rigor as opposed to the very formalistic Western religions like the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church or the Episcopalians who are now in the United States of America and are in communion with the Anglican Church, or the Methodist Church or the SDA Church. African religion is indeed alive and well. And where it is, it resonates with the people. If you go to Benin, for example, you'll find them. And of course, those who are in the business of condemning everything Africa, including us Africans, are quick to dismiss them, that those are not in keeping with what we understand religion to be. Yet they forget that many of these religions are man-made and have corrupted the message of God. Slavery, as we already know, there is not a society where there was no slavery of some kind. Whether you go to the European tribes, or you go to the Asian tribes, or even the Chinese, or within Africa, there was a sense in which as people fought, they also enslaved others and used them as labor, and ultimately they became incorporated in their societies. But those who are very low-key slavery, that was very low-key slavery or enslavement at that time, whether the Germanic tribes were enslaving the Romanic tribes, whether the Slavs were enslaving their others, and the Mongolians and that kind of thing, or in China, whether there was enslavement within Africa. We know the many fights between Temne and Mende, the Congo Empire, where they were enslaving others. That was there. But the slavery that we ought to focus on, and which has preoccupied human historians, was what was initiated in the 15th to the 16th century and ultimately led to the Transatlantic Triangle. Because prior to that, the engagements were very commercial. I read about how the Congo Empire, the Portuguese came and took some Congolese leaders and took them to Lisbon, and they were friends, and after 4 years they came back. But something happened. And when the gun was discovered, it became a source of power for European powers. And you now begin to see, particularly when Europe is agrarian and they need labor. Remember, there are no tractors, and even when there are other implements, the ox is being used as an instrument, or the horse, you needed human labor. Then you suddenly discover that the black man is capable of withstanding certain environmental realities which the Caucasian cannot, which the Asian cannot, and therefore you have found a gem, you've found gold in the form of human, and you begin to use him. And those who have gone to the United States of America and are in the business of farming, because suddenly the Caucasians have also gone to the United States of America and into Latin America. And if you go into those areas, they decimated the populations. If you go to the Caribbean, they decimated the Arawakans completely. They decimated the American, indigenous Americans, whom they mistook for Indians, and that's why they called them the Red Indians. And then the trade started in earnest, the transatlantic trade, where, as we know, no less than 12 million people taken largely from the western coast of Africa and even southern Africa, from Angola, some from Mozambique, from Ghana, and that general coast, Gambia, Senegal, La Côte d'Ivoire, Democratic Republic of Congo. And all these individuals are being transported, some to Europe, but largely We find them in what is now the United States of America and in Latin America and in the Caribbean. And they are used to farm. Remember, that is the period when farming, cotton farming, sugarcane, soya, groundnuts, and all these things are being grown in that part of the world to feed Europe. To feed Europe during different phases of famine, whether it's the Irish potato, that the famine in Ireland, whether it is feeding people during the so-called World War I, whether it's feeding people during those difficult times, it is Africans who constitute labor. And when Europe begins to industrialize, once again, you need labor. When you start talking about the building, construction of railways, the subways in Europe, particularly in the United Kingdom, in England, you are taking slaves that had been taken to the Caribbean and you take them now from Jamaica and those parts of the world to the United Kingdom. So you have a population of people from Africa, from different nations, who are de-ethnicized. Their language is taken away. Their culture is taken away. Their spirituality is decimated. Their names are taken away. Families are destroyed. They become breeders of even more labor. You have children, and then those children are torn away from you, and you never know where they go, and they become labor in some part of the world. I mean, if you talk about man's inhumanity to man, you see the way we breed chicken now, the way we breed cows now, the way we breed horses now, that is the way Africans were dealt with by the enslavers in the United States and in Europe and in the Caribbean. That's how they were dealt with. And when you are dealt with like that over a period of no less than 400 years, the impact is devastating. And that impact is alive and well. So that even when people talk about the emancipation in the 19th century, when you talk about emancipation, whether it is in Europe, emancipation, and then you stop slavery and slave trade, really nothing dramatic has changed. As Martin Luther King Jr. used to say, you free a man and you tell the man or woman to lift themselves by their bootstraps, and they have no boots. You free men and you tell them we are going to give you 40 acres and a mule, and you don't give them 40 acres and a mule. That is the state in which the people we now call African Americans in the United States of America and the people we know who are of African origin in the Caribbean and in Latin America or South America or wherever they are to be found, the impact on them is devastating. They hear about a distant land where their ancestors came from, but they have no connection with that land. Some of them hear that they may have been Igbo or Yoruba, or Temne or Mende or Vambo or Vimbundu, or Congo or Bangala, but they don't know. So what do? They look for a needle in a haystack through DNA. And that is what they are doing. It is an attempt at self-discovery, an attempt at discovery, but the impact is huge. Because even in those lands that you built, you are being discriminated against. This is how we must understand the activities of great African men who in the early days, because of the impact of slavery, Marcus Mosiah Garvey was saying, let us go back where we came from, the Black Star movement. Sylvester Williams on Trinidad and Tobago, let's go back where we came from. John Hendrick, let's go back where we came from. W.B. Du Bois, let us go where we came from. And much later, we begin to hear people such as Malcolm X and much more during that period, Martin Luther King Jr. In other words, the battle for self-discovery has never stopped. It has always been there, because when you lose touch with your spiritual anchors, the soul keeps on yearning for something. The soul of the African slave has never rested. It is still seeking to be attached to something. But the target is a moving target, sometimes even a mirage, yet the search continues and will continue. You know, in the United States, the movement for abolition, particularly when you talk about the abolition in the former colonies, started in earnest in the 19th century, in the 1860s, in the early 1860s. That is when you begin to see legislators in the United Kingdom, such as William Wilberforce, talking about freeing the slaves. And William Wilberforce, addressing the House of Commons, actually says that even when we free them, we should not give them freedom. We should train them on how to be free, because they have not known how to be free. In fact, Malcolm X said it a little while that when you've taught a man or a woman to go through the back door for too long, even when you open the front door, they'll still look for a back door. And if there is none, they'll create one. That is the movement in Europe, abolition. And there were people who did not want it abolished because it was lucrative. Banks such as Barclays Bank, which we know, are founded on the back of slavery. Lloyd's, which is one of the biggest insurance companies, was founded on the basis of slavery. And this is factual. You can prove it. They have apologized to the world. So the United States of America, which was a colony of Great Britain, of the United Kingdom, also regains our independence, as we now know, the Declaration of Independence in the 18th century. And one of the most amazing things about the American Declaration of Independence is they start by saying, or they say in the early parts, that we hold this truth to be self-evident, that all men are born equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it's for this reason that governments are instituted amongst men. But when they say all men at that time, they don't mean women. They don't mean persons of color. And there is something that we don't talk about, but in history is called the Missouri Compromise, which was, they came about in what is now the Missouri. And it talked about a black man not being a complete man. So that in 1863, during the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, when he says that no country, no society can survive and thrive when there is one part is half slave and half free, Abraham Lincoln becomes the president of the United States of America who abolishes slavery. But he does so at a time when America is divided. Northern America has started to industrialize. So you go to places like Pittsburgh, you go to places in the north, the industrialization is already coming about. Southern America is still very agrarian. So America is divided. And when, of course, he announces the abolition of slavery, then America goes to civil war. The American Civil War is about retention of slavery. The Southerners are saying, this is our bread and butter. How can you possibly take it away from our mouths? So he's seen as an antagonist by those who supported slavery. Ultimately, of course, the Northerners or the federal government does win, and the slaves are freed, so to speak, but it is a journey. The fact that a pronouncement has been made that we have abolished slavery does not mean that slavery has ended. We still have individuals who are, if you are imprisoned, you've been a slave all your life and you are told to go. Where do you go? How do you start? You get used to that condition so that the so-called freedom becomes dangerous. But ultimately, at least at the level of the laws and at the level of politics, we know that slavery has been abolished in the United States of America, but the struggle continues. It is never lost on me that the slavery is abolished in 1863. And in 1963, 100 years later, we are still talking about the civil rights movement. The African American is still not free. We are still talking about the right to vote. We have so many activities taking place for over 100 years. People who do not want African Americans to be free are still alive and working for 100 years. And if you are an American president and you take sides with freedom, they assassinate you. That's how they assassinated Abraham Lincoln. That is how they assassinated John F. Kennedy in 1961. So that the struggle is one that is continuous. And it is a struggle that has many dimensions. So that even in the 21st century, when you hear the story of George Floyd and says, "I cannot breathe," slavery is institutionalized. So that while individuals may not themselves think that is a good thing, the institutions are structured in such a way that it still sustains slavery in a subtle way. But slavery as we know it in the United States of America was abolished in 1863. But a luta continua, Victoria Arceta. The struggle continues until we attain victory, as they would have said in Portuguese. You know, there was something in 1865, particularly after there had been struggles. I think one of the Americans, very senior officials, I forget his name, said that when you free people, give them 40 acres and a mule so that they start from somewhere. It was thought that at that time, really, you must start. I've been working for you for all this while. You've freed me. I have a family. How am I going to survive? So give me something to start. And this is exactly what was said. Give them 40 acres and a mule. And of course, nobody got 40 acres and a mule, so that they found themselves in the wilderness, groping in the dark. You used to work, you used to wake up and work. And when you worked, you ate, and you had somewhere to sleep. Now you are free. But what kind of freedom is this? There is no work. There is nothing to eat. You are starting literally from zero. From the unknown to the unknown. You can imagine how traumatizing it is. Not easy. So 40 acres and a mule became a fiction. That I remember several years ago, there was an African American who came to Kenya, and he was called Shaka Zulu Asegai, and he filed a case in the Kenyan courts demanding that he be given 40 acres and a mule. Of course, it didn't go very far, but he was reminding the world that indeed there was such a promise which was not kept. I had the honor and privilege of acting for him. You know, slavery and colonization have deep impacts because they are institutionalized, and there is a sense in which they even go into our behavioral DNA. I remember reading a book which was written in 1933 in the United States of America by one of the leading African-American educators called Carter G. Woodson. It's called Miseducation of the Negro. And in Miseducation of the Negro, Carter G. Woodson is looking at the American education system and say, we have all along been miseducated because this education does not tell us who we are. And it does not tell us how valuable we are. And when attempts are made during that period, even prior to that, to build American institution in the United States of America. You remember they built blacks or colored institutions such as Howard University. They did Harvard, which was white, privileged people, then Howard universities, and they started building these universities in the United States of America to begin to ensure that there was blacks who are joining the education system through affirmative action. So, but even before that, you had attempts at building colleges by people like Booker Taliaferro, Washington, in Tuskegee. And just to tell you how this thing is not easy to defeat, Booker T. Washington was telling blacks, you are supposed to only do these things. When you go to school, there are certain things you should not study. That is not for you. It is W.B. Du Bois who comes and says that we must have an education system that integrates people. Whether you are white, whether you are colored, we are all one, building the United States of America. But there are those within the white community who want and have retained and have continued to retain institutions which are not colorblind. They still see people from the perspective of color. They still see persons who are black as not worthy of holding certain offices. They still treat blacks in a manner that is not consistent with what is in the Constitution of the United States of America. Recently, there was a case in the United States of America where a young African was going outside of his father's house to throw trash. And 5 white policemen arrested him outside because, of course, he was a black young man, looked suspicious. That is institutional. So it calls into question, how do we train police officers? How do we train our workers? And blacks therefore feel that they are disadvantaged, and sometimes on a scale of 1 to 10, the white police officers will treat blacks very differently. If you look at the number of blacks who are in prison relative to their population size, is the largest population in prison. And this is why we would have this conversation about Black Lives Matter. When you hear about George Floyd being treated in the manner that he is being treated, and he's saying, I can't breathe, and there are white officers stepping on his neck, his interpretation is that if it was a white person in a similar situation, he or she would have been treated differently. So these are cries of the unheard, and they continue to do so in order to remind the system that things have not changed in the manner that they ought to have changed. And you can now see that that conversation is not only confined to the black. Asians are now beginning to have the same complaint in the United States of America. They are now beginning to say, Asian lives matter. There was a time when the Chinese also said, Chinese lives matter. In fact, there is now also a talk of white lives matter, because the Caucasians are beginning to realize that in the next 30 years, the demographics in the United States of America will change very dramatically, and the Latinos may be more, and whites may become the minority. So when you hear these cries about Black Lives Matter, to me, it is a message to the entire society that the sooner we begin to treat everybody equally, the sooner we are safer. And that is why some of us have always argued that we should talk about all lives matter, that we should now, our conversation should change. But our conversation will only change when people feel that they are being treated equally. And feelings and perception are very difficult to deal with. When you think that you are being oppressed, sometimes even when you are not being oppressed, you just feel you are being oppressed. And that, I think, is what we should be addressing. Why is it that the blacks in the United States of America are saying in the year 2023 what their leaders say in 1963, 60 years later. What have we not done for the last 60 years, and what should we do so that in the next 10 years, we don't hear that argument? I think that that is very important going forward, so that we should not dismiss them, but we should find and ask, what are we not doing? What are we not doing in the health sector? What are we not doing in the education sector? What are we not doing in the policing sector? What are we not doing in the army? What are we not doing in all these sectors, so that you, our black brothers, may feel that you are part of it, that you are at the dinner table with everybody else, and that you are not eating crumbs? Until we address that question, you'll always hear cry, Black Lives Matter. Yet it is a solvable problem. The United States of America, to use this psychiatric term, is schizophrenic. It has different personalities. There is a personality of the United States of America which did great things after the war in 1945 with the Marshall Plan, and helped in lifting Europe out of the pains of the war between 1939 and 1945. That is a good United States. There is a United States of America which presided over the creation of the United Nations in 1945 in San Francisco, and with good ideals. The UN Charter is good. There is a good United States of America which was present and provided leadership in 1948 when they sat in Paris and came up with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That was a good United States of America. There was a United States of America which was behind a number of African countries, when not in the manner that it should, but at least supported decolonization. But there is another United States of America which must worry the world. A United States of America which Martin Luther King Jr. described in 1961 during the Vietnam War as the most arrogant nation on earth, the most divisive nation on earth, the nation that it thinks that it should dictate to the world what the world should do. That United States of America is a United States of America which thinks it should poke its nose everywhere. It thinks that here it has a Coca-Cola-like, a McDonald's-like form of democracy, which all of us should embrace whether we like it or not. That United States of America is a United States of America which we do not understand. Why must we do what they want? While at home, they are not doing the right thing. I remember in 1960s, when there was a compulsory draft of young men and women to go and fight in Vietnam, the Muhammad Ali, who was a heavyweight boxer at that time, refused the draft, and he said, "Why should I go and fight and kill the Viet Congs? What have they done to me? You want me to go and fight the Viet Congs while in the United States of America, persons of color are not treated right?" And he refused, and he was stripped of his world heavyweight title at that time. That United States of America is a United States of America, in my view, which should re-examine herself. That United States of America is a United States of America which we have seen intervene in Vietnam and messed up Vietnam. That United States of America we have seen intervene in Somalia, and it messed up Somalia. That United States of America, jointly with Belgium, was responsible for the assassination of Patrice Emery Lumumba. That United States of America was present in Afghanistan and left it in a mess. That United States of America is in Syria, which is in a mess. That United States of America is the United States of America which said there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and there were none, and Iraq is in a mess. That United States of America is the one that said Muammar al-Gaddafi was messing up Libya, and Libya is in a mess. I think that United States of America owes the world an apology. That United States of America ought to embrace humility. That United States of America continues to engage in activities which are equivalent to modern-day slavery. That United States of America is one that we must, those of us who are prayerful, pray for, that they may know change of attitude.